I mean, everything about the choices that they make with their sexual decisions is the reverse of what it ought to be. You should be faithful. They're chronically unfaithful. You should not bring your mistress in front of your wife. They parade them around. You should not feed your teen son pornography. He does. On and on and on. We're going to see this play out where down is up and up is down for them sexually. In every decision they make, it's like the photo negative of what it ought to be. Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jessica Nell, and if you're new, then welcome. I'd love to earn your subscription today. We are on episode 2 of The Kennedy Men, 3 Generations of Sex, Scandal, and Secrets. And last time we got into Joe Kennedy, we got into the start of his relationship with Rose, their marriage, their political backgrounds. Each one of them came from political dynasties. She was the daughter of the Boston mayor. He was the son of a city boss who had served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, and he had watched his father jimmy elections and make deals behind the scenes with power players in the underworld, as well as the respectable sphere of influence in the political world. So he had grown up watching that. She had grown up watching that. And together they joined forces and decided to create a dynasty. So today we are getting into the next bit of the story. By the time their second son, John F. Kennedy, arrived on May 29, 1917, the United States was in the middle of the First World War. While many of Joe's contemporaries enlisted in the so-called war to end all wars, Joe set about turning this global tragedy to his advantage. Joe was hired by Charles Schwab. Yes, that Charles Schwab, head of the Bethlehem Steel Corporation and a friend of Honey Fitz, who was, of course, Rose's father, to work at the Four River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, where ships were being built for the Navy. Joe immediately clashed with the labor unions, and the resulting strike paralyzed the yard. It took Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, to smooth out the situation, and Joe was demoted and relieved of supervisory duties until the end of the war, when he returned to private enterprise. Now we're going to get into Rose. It says the transition from debutante to suburban matron was difficult for Rose. For a while, things looked up when Honey Fitz considered making a comeback. Fitz, full of confidence, was unaware that the city, especially its political circles, were abuzz with talk of his latest protege, a blonde cigarette girl known as Toodles Ryan. He made it clear he planned to challenge the incumbent, his longtime rival. But suddenly his rival made an announcement. I am preparing 3 addresses, which, if necessary, I shall deliver in the fall, and which, if a certain individual had the right to restrict free speech, I would not be permitted to deliver. One of the addresses is entitled Graft, Ancient and Modern. Another, Great Lovers from Cleopatra to Toodles. And last but not least, Libertines, from Henry VIII to the present day. That is a shot across the bow, isn't it? Very, very ruthless. Taking the hint, Honey Fitz announced the next day that he would not be the candidate for mayor after all. Gone was the glory then of the life of being the mayor's daughter, and the joy of a bride was soon gone. Also, as Rose discovered, she was married to a money-mad workaholic who would be away from home for months at a time. But she still had her children, and the only thing she ever really shared with Joe, her dream of a dynasty. Rose, quote, the Kennedys are a self-contained unit. Years ago, we decided that our children were going to be our best friends and that we never could see too much of them, she told an interviewer in the late 30s. Since we couldn't do both, it was better to bring up our family than to go out to dinners. The Kennedys are a self-contained unit. If any of us wants to sail or play golf or go walking or just talk, there's always a Kennedy eager to join in. If you don't know, that is her literal voice. You can go and look it up. It was this tight-knit closeness that would be the political strength of the Kennedy men. Ultimately, it would also be their undoing. On September 13th, 1918, Rose gave birth to her first daughter, Rose Marie, who would always be known as Rosemary, and who would become the most troubled and tragic of the Kennedys. In years to come, Rose Kennedy would be held up as an example of a devoted, selfless mother buoyed by her profound religious faith. The truth is that Rose suffered all the exhaustion, depression, and conflicts of any mother, especially one who bore a child almost every 18 months for 17 years straight, and got little emotional support from her husband. Even with a household staff and a generous budget, the loneliness, responsibilities of motherhood, and social obscurity were finally too much for Rose. In January 1920, 8 months pregnant with her fourth child, she packed her bags and moved back in with her parents, leaving her 3 young children behind with Joe and the servants. Now, that would be Joe Jr., Jack, and Rosemary. So she was pregnant with her fourth and finally decided she had had enough. And so she goes back to move in with Honey Fitz. The catalyst for Rose's daring move was Joe's philandering. Almost from the beginning of the marriage, Joe had romanced other women, mostly glamorous chorus girls, not unlike his father-in-law's one-time favorite, Toodles Ryan. Among his conquests was the beautiful blonde star of silent films, Betty Compson, whom he wooed with diamonds and furs on his frequent trips to New York. I mean, this from Joe imitating Honey Fitz reminds me of Jackie. She marries Jack, who fools around on her, but he's following the pattern that she already had as the familiar one from her own father, who was called Blackjack. So it's interesting. It's like the fathers have groomed their daughters into accepting this bad behavior as just part of the deal. You marry a guy who's politically connected, you marry a guy who's well off, and you also get mistresses on the side. That may be just part of the arrangement that they come to expect, although she has moved out because of his philandering. And later we'll see, probably in this book, Jackie reportedly didn't put up with it fully either, that she ended up using it for her advantage. But let's see what happens with Rose. Rose actually found little welcome in her own home. Honey Fitz pressured his daughter to resume her duties, and after 3 weeks informed that 2.5-year-old Jack was ill with scarlet fever, Rose reluctantly returned to Beals Street in time to give birth to a second daughter, Kathleen, on February 20th. Materially, Rose wanted for nothing. Just before her 5th child, Eunice, was born in July 10th, 1921, the family moved to a larger house at 131 Naples in Brookline. Because of Joe's increasingly risky activities, the house was put in Rose's name. Rose's theory, so I'm assuming, in my head when I read it at first, I thought that meant his sexually risky behavior, that this was her ploy to have, a negotiating tactic. I think actually this is referring to his risky financial behaviors, that the house was put in her name to protect their assets. Rose's theory of child rearing was simple. I always felt that if the older children are brought up right, the younger ones will follow their lead. As the first son, Joe Jr., took precedence, Rose explained, it was easy for all of the children to look up to Joe Jr. because he was a good scholar, a good athlete, and popular with girls as well as men in every neighborhood where we lived. Rose chose to ignore young Joe's bullying, immortalized in 1921 family photo, posing young Joe Jr. and Jack together, where it is clear that Joe Jr. is squeezing Jack's hand so hard, Jack is grimacing. Now, I went to look for that photo, and I couldn't find it. Now, we do get a photo of this silent film star that Joe had romanced, and we get a photo of Joe in the 1930s. So there he is. And I'll show photos along the way. In Brookline in the early 1920s, Joe was considered a hellraiser, the kind of boy who, quote, couldn't pass a hat without squashing it or leaving an unprotected shin unkicked. Goodness. He was cracked on the head by the sisters with a catechism book so often, it was a wonder the top of his head wasn't flatter than a pancake, is the quote. Couldn't pass a hat without squashing it, couldn't leave an unprotected shin unkicked. I mean, if this is her philosophy that the older children being brought up right will set the other ones right, what are you doing? Letting a boy go around kicking people, hurting other humans, and also treating objects with such disregard. I would just think that if this is your philosophy, that the older child should be raised the most carefully, then what are you doing raising a child that's described in this way? He sounds like a real punk. According to psychohistorian Nancy Gager Clinch, author of The Kennedy Neurosis, quote, Joe's constant attempts to dominate his younger brother and his apparently insatiable need for stardom strongly suggest a deep-seated ego lack, a need for public reaffirmation, identity, and applause. Such a probable lack is not hard to understand in view of the constant parental pressures, the ceaseless criticism, although tempered with praise, and the example of a father who established that ruthless activity is the sure route to success. Eunice recalled her big brother, quote, he was very good, but he had a quite strong temper and would be cross as a billy goat and would blame somebody else when he didn't win. That's his sister's description of Eunice. The next subtitle is Frank Costello. I helped Joe Kennedy get rich. At 31, Joe went to work for Galen Stone of Haydenstone. Here he was exposed to the inside information that informed his stock market speculation and established him as a plunger. Joe made his money in ethically questionable stock pools, inflating cheap stocks through rumors and erratic but well-publicized buying and selling. The action was calculated to impress naive investors, and when the price of the stock was inflated sufficiently, the pool would sell short for huge profits. The humble investor would be left holding the bag when the stocks went down. So this is why, especially in the early days of the stock market, speculation was seen as such a wicked thing. It is still seen poorly, but now the market is so large that it takes a great deal of people to do this ballooning of stocks. But at this time, when the stock market was much smaller, someone high profile like Joe Kennedy could overinflate a stock price by getting involved, and then it would make other people think, oh, that's the next stock that's going to move. So they would all jump on it, which would increase the price, and then he gets to sell and make a quick profit. The cash that fueled Joe's speculating came from bootlegging. The 18th Amendment prohibition had passed in 1919, and since then, Joe had been actively involved in illegally importing liquor. He formed alliances with crime bosses in major markets, among them Boston, New York, Chicago, and New Orleans. These would come in handy years later when his son was running for national office. Among his mob associates was Frank Costello, former boss of the Luciano crime family, who bragged, I helped Joe Kennedy get rich. Sam Giancana, who would later figure prominently in Jack's presidency, called Joe, quote, one of the biggest crooks who ever lived, end quote. The bootlegging business called for guts and nerves of steel, which Joe had in spades, but his hot temper brought him into a nearly fatal scrape with Detroit's Purple Gang. Joe had moved bootleg rum through their territory without their permission. Fearing for his life, he had to turn to Diamond Joe Esposito of Chicago to intervene. Joe's access to bootleg whiskey made him a popular guy in other circles, too. He supplied liquor for his 10th class reunion at Harvard in 1922. One classmate said, it came ashore the way the Pilgrims did. In spite of her burgeoning family, Rose refused to be tied down and continued to travel widely. I have come to think that Rose was the first eat, pray, love example for everyone, except without the affairs. It seems that she was exhibiting marital fidelity, unlike her husband, but she did go for the self-love and me time that has been popular the last, 15 years in modern women's circles of like, you've got to take care of you first, girl. You got to put your own mask on. You got to take care of you. Well, Rose was the first in this line of women acting like that. Even though she had many children, it says perhaps it was a way of striking back at Joe for his own frequent absences. One famous episode demonstrating Rose's wanderlust occurred right after Easter Sunday, 1923, as Rose prepared to leave with her sister Agnes for a 3-week trip to California. I mean, I've been a mom now for almost 23 years. I've never been away from my children for 3 weeks. That is a crazy long amount of time. Not that I'm the standard, but I can't imagine being away from my children. And this was just one of many trips. I mean, what about you? Is that something that your mom did? Is that something you've done as a mother? Like, that is a long time to be away from your children. It was Jack, young Jack, JFK, who protested, "Gee, you're a great mother to go away and leave your children alone." But Rose left anyway. I mean, can you imagine not just planning a 3-week trip, but then as you're getting ready to go, one of your children saying that to you and you're not going, "You know what, darling, I'll be back as soon as I can. Like, I love you," or something, reassurance. And even like, "You know what, I'm going to shorten my trip. That is too long." Or, "I'm going to mend my ways. I'm going to go on this trip, but then I'm not going to go for a really long time because I see that you need me." Like, none of that. He's been sickly. There's lots of children, and yet she is just traveling the globe. Jack, the more sensitive of her 2 older sons, later told his roommate Lem Billings that he cried every time she packed her bags until he realized it did no good. Better to take it in stride, he concluded. This would be emotional acceptance of neglect out of necessity. I mean, it's sad. It's like, the infant who stops crying because they've been left in the crib. This is a child who needs his mother and yet realizes crying does no good. I'm sad, but she won't come anyway. In 1923, at age 35, Joe set up his own office as Joseph P. Kennedy, banker. By the mid-1920s, he had built a fortune estimated at $2 million. In today's money, that's $36.5 million. So by the mid-20s, at age 35, so 35, 37, somewhere in there, his fortune was the equivalent of a modern-day $36.5 million. Joe liked to bet on sure things. He bought and sold stock as an insider, profiting from friendships and knowledge to plunge into Wall Street pools and to manipulate stocks like Chicago Yellow Cab. He also took steps to properly educate his 2 oldest sons. It was one of the few areas in which he seriously disagreed with Rose. His own people had embraced the mainstream, sending him to the non-sectarian Boston Latin School, while Rose's family remained almost tribal in their Irish Catholic roots. Joe once exploded when a Boston paper referred to him as an Irish American. Listen to his response. "How long do you have to live in this country before you become an American? We've been here for 2 generations. Isn't that enough?" And on this, I agree with Joseph Kennedy. I think, once you have immigrated and made yourself part of this society, you are American. That's the whole point of being American. I don't think we should have hyphenated American anythings. Now, it's okay, of course, to recognize your heritage, to say, "I'm an Irish American," or "I'm a Cajun," or "I'm an African American," or whatever. But at the end of the day, really, we're just Americans. And I really agree with that. Joe let Rose send the girls to convent school, but he insisted that Joe Jr. and Jack join the mainstream, which to him meant the Protestant establishment. In the fall of 1924, he enrolled his 2 oldest sons in the prestigious Dexter School. They were the 2 Catholics in that school. Joe was much less involved with the girls. When Rose gave birth to their 4th daughter, Patricia, in Boston, Joe was miles away in a suite at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. He was attempting a takeover of the Yellow Cab Company. Quote, "I woke up one morning exhausted and I realized I hadn't been out of that hotel room in 7 weeks," he recalled. "My baby Pat had been born and was almost a month old, and I hadn't even seen her." Can you guys even believe that? This is Patricia. She's the one who married Peter Lawford, who actually, I have an amazing biography from him that I have been reading the last few months. I've thought about doing it on the channel. Let me know if you're interested at some point. That could be a great summer read, I think. But fascinating individual, very unique story with Peter Lawford. But Patricia married him, but she's just one of the middle Kennedys, who people kind of overlook. We know the older ones, and we know Teddy and Robert. But those girls in the middle, the Eunice, Patricia, and Jean, we can sometimes get confused. But this is Patricia. He had been in the hotel for 7 weeks and hadn't even met her. By the time Joe's third son, Robert Francis, was born on November 20th, 1925 in Brookline, Joe was making plans to move his entire family from Boston to New York, which is interesting because that's where RFK would later become a senator. Chapter 2, Joe heads for Hollywood alone. Pearl Buck, whose book I actually just got, said it this way: the Kennedy men were never celebrated for faithfulness to their wives, but their wives found it worthwhile to continue as wives and mothers. Yes, this was an observation Maureen Callahan made in Ask Not, that while we're all tempted to feel great pity for the wives in these Kennedy marriages, they were opting in. They were staying in, and they knew what they were getting into. They might not have liked the feeling of it once they got into the marriage, but they knew what they were signing up for. After making his fortune on and off Wall Street, Joe was one of the first Eastern businessmen to grasp the potential of the movie business. This is interesting. Did you know about Joe Kennedy's Hollywood background? I did not know about this. In February 1926, he acquired the Film Booking Office of America, FBO, sight unseen from its British owners. The small movie company specialized in melodramas and low-budget westerns. FBO was barely in the same business as MGM, Paramount, and Fox, but the industry was about to undergo major changes. The following year, the Warner Brothers would rock the world, and in the fallout of that, Joe Kennedy would end up controlling the destiny of a filmdom superstar. At the same time that he plunged into movies, Joe took steps to protect his fortune and the future of his children. He moved to establish the first of a series of trust funds that would eventually make all of his children financially independent. He set up these trust funds that would eventually ensure that each one of them had $20 million apiece. Joe encouraged the idea that he did this to make his children independent, but Jack himself dismissed this. He was speculating, he said. It was a very risky business. He was speculating pretty hard, and his health was not good at the time, and that was the reason he did it. There was no other reason for it. In 1927, Joe moved his family out of Boston. They went to a 13-room mansion on 5 wooded acres in Riverdale, New York, overlooking the Hudson River. Joe claimed that he moved his brood because his daughters would never be invited to join the clubs of Boston, but it really was the fact that he was working more and more in New York. He didn't even see his daughter in the first month of her life. So, he's making this effort to hopefully bring the family a little closer to where he's doing his business. The next section is headlined, Joe teaches his sons how to entertain your mistress in the bosom of your family. So, buckle up. While Joe was building his fortune, he also found time to play, contracting a soon-to-be notorious liaison with the superstar Gloria Swanson. Now, we do have a photo of her as well, which I'll show you. It says, Gloria Swanson, the first superstar, was a woman who lived life on her own terms, the opposite of the dutiful Rose. No wonder Joe was smitten, and no wonder their notorious affair could not last. So there's his love affair partner. They met for the first time in the Renaissance room of the Savoy Plaza Hotel on Fifth Avenue. With her glamour, international fame, financial independence, and 3 previous marriages, Gloria Swanson was unlike any other woman Joe had ever met. She was still married to her third husband, a French marquis. But at this point, through high spending, bad business decisions, and clashes with studio heads, Gloria Swanson was almost broke. The attraction between Joe and Gloria was immediate, and each realized the potential of the other, but they did not get together at that point. Joe left to join his family for Christmas in Riverdale, while Gloria and the Marquis headed west for California. Immediately after the holidays, though, he was on the phone inviting them to join him in Palm Beach. Swanson, the Marquis, and her 17 pieces of luggage arrived by train, and Gloria knew immediately that she and Joe would soon become lovers. A day later, they were consummating the affair in the Royal Poinciana Hotel, while Joe's right-hand man, Eddie Moore, took the star's husband deep sea fishing. So he has this arrangement of, you take care of the husband, I'll take care of her. In her memoir, Swanson recalled the magical moment. Now listen to this description and tell me if it sounds magical to you. So he stares her down for more than a minute before he enters the hotel room. And then he just comes, grabs her, starts kissing her. After a hasty climax, he lay beside me, stroking my hair. Apart from his guilty, passionate mutterings, he had still said nothing cogent. So this is not some sort of deeply connected romantic affair. This is physical and even like completely for him. Nothing at all focused on her. Swanson was by no means Joe's first extramarital adventure, but she was his first real affair. She was the perfect trophy to symbolize the great worldly success that he had now achieved. Rose, on the other hand, pregnant with their 8th child, had returned to Boston to be treated by her regular obstetrician. She gives birth to a 5th daughter, Jean Ann, so that's the daughter that's between Robert and Teddy. Joe, too busy to visit, sends her a beautiful diamond bracelet. So he's given up on this whole, I wasn't there for Patricia, now we're going to live close. He's just like, here's a bracelet. Swanson sent a telegram of congratulations and flowers. Rose spent a month resting in Boston while the faithful Eddie Moore and his wife Mary looked after the other children. So they can't be with Dad. They don't even have relatives that they're trusting them with. It's his assistant, Eddie, who's helping him have affairs. He's also helping watch the children while she recovers from having her 8th baby. That March, Swanson and Joe met with a director about the possibility of the 3 of them working together. This director, Erich von Stroheim, was an acknowledged genius, but he was also a spendthrift, egotist, and megalomaniac. Joe was convinced that he could handle him. After extensive negotiations, contracts were signed, and filming began. Set in Europe in the days before World War I, it's the story of a German kingdom and an innocent convent girl with a mad queen and a dashing prince. Filming began in Hollywood, and a far-sighted Joe managed to get Stroheim to introduce sound into some of the picture. According to the director, Joe told him, Vaughn, the lousiest sound film will be better than the best silent film. That is far-seeing. That is insightful. So Joe was a little bit of a far-thinking owner at this point. Although Joe was meeting success on the New York Stock Exchange and Hollywood sound stages and boudoirs, he was still shut out of the Protestant establishment, which was the only bastion of power that meant anything to him. In 1928, he was deeply disappointed when he was not invited to be on Harvard's board of overseers. He's going to continue to be disappointed by Harvard. To Joe, this was just another example of the Brahmin prejudice that had kept him out of the best clubs when he was a student. They were happy to drink his bootleg liquor, but they still considered him an outsider. Rose also felt the sting of this kind of exclusion. And a few years later, when Jack was at Harvard, she asked a friend of his, a member of the Brahmin class, "Tell me, when are the nice people of Boston going to accept us?" It's interesting because she had grown up as the mayor of Boston's daughter, so she still isn't accepted. In the fall of 1929, Joe sent Joe Jr. to Choate, one of the finest prep schools in the country. He was immediately nicknamed Ratface and subjected to the same kind of hazing and bullying by upperclassmen that he had doled out to younger siblings at home. I mean, that's kind of turnabout, right? But he survived and adjusted, and by senior year, he won the school's Harvard Trophy, awarded to the graduate who best combined scholarship and sportsmanship. That same year, Joe acquired the 15-room, 9-bathroom Hyannisport house that they had rented on Nantucket Sound for the last 3 summers, and immediately had a screening room installed. You know, I had heard about this, but when I read about it, I didn't realize that he had been in the business of movie making. So it makes much more sense why they would have a screening room at that point in history. At Hyannisport, the children became known as strong competitors who stuck together. No matter what anyone else had done, the Kennedy children always praised each other's accomplishments to the skies, one companion recalled. They were particularly poor sports and graceless losers. There would be hell to pay if they didn't win every race, another witness recalled. Sometimes corners were cut, and the discovery that Joe Jr. once used a mainsail larger than allowed by class regulations in a race did not endear them to their neighbors. So they would go against the rules. They would use things that you weren't allowed to use and yet win and still retain the award. As Joe spent months at a time in Hollywood, Rose must have come to feel like a minor colonial official, stationed in a dead-end post of the empire, with no one to talk to but ungrateful subordinates and unruly neighbors. By spring, production on the movie Queen Kelly was shut down, and Joe reluctantly fired the director. The energy seemed to go out of the project. Joe decided to cut his losses and killed the production entirely. As the romance between Joe and Gloria heated up, the star and her daughter visited the Kennedy family at Hyannisport that summer, and Joe took this opportunity to demonstrate to his sons how it was possible to fully entertain your mistress in the presence of your wife and children. Such lessons did not always come easy, but this was, after all, a man who laid out pornographic magazines on Jack's bed when he was 14. I mean, everything about the choices that they make with their sexual decisions is the reverse of what it ought to be. You should be faithful. They're chronically unfaithful. You should not bring your mistress in front of your wife. They parade them around. You should not feed your teen son pornography. He does. On and on and on. We're going to see this play out where down is up and up is down for them sexually. In every decision they make, it's like the photo negative of what it ought to be. One afternoon, Joe took Gloria sailing on the Rose Elizabeth. They were supposed to be alone to discuss important movie business, but young Jack, then just 12 years old, and perhaps also curious about the movie business, sneaked up and surprised them. Whatever he saw shocked him so badly he leaped overboard, and his father had to rescue him. Afterward, Joe briefed his son in what to say on their return to shore. So there's Jack being given a close-up look at the affair and the covering up and lying about the affair. The lesson was learned. A father's sexual ethics can exert a powerful influence on his son's attitude towards women, says a professor of child psychiatry from Yale. While in some instances a son will react to his father's philandering by vowing never to subject his own wife to the indignities that his own mother suffered, in many cases, sons of blatantly womanizing fathers use their parents as role models. Watching their fathers, seeing what they do, sets the stage for their own actions. Simply put, they feel, if Dad does it, it must be all right, because he wouldn't do anything that was wrong. This was a lesson that all Kennedy men would take to heart. Well, back in Hollywood, Joe hires Edmund Goulding to direct Gloria in her first talkie. Joe decided that he and Rose would accompany Gloria to the movie's European premieres in Paris and London. And in her memoir, Swanson claimed that she and her friend Virginia sailed with Joe and Rose to Europe, But historian Doris Kearns Goodwin noted that this notorious ocean trip never happened. Swanson describes it in detail in her memoir, but according to Goodwin, records reveal that when the Kennedys left New York, Gloria and Virginia had already departed 10 days earlier on a different ship. They did all return together, and Swanson may have needed their support, for in Paris, she had discovered that her cuckolded husband was in fact having an affair of his own with her rival star. Despite her grief, Gloria took the time in Europe to introduce Rose to Lucien Lelong, a leading couturier. This marked the beginning of an interest in clothes that would eventually find Rose a place on the best dressed lists. It was only after they all returned to the States that there was any hint that Rose understood what was going on between Gloria Swanson and her husband. According to Swanson, Cardinal O'Connell of Boston called on her in New York that October, making it clear to her that Joe would not divorce the mother of his 8 children. But divorce was never what Joe had in mind. He merely sought to live apart from Rose and pursue his own life. So he doesn't want a divorce, he just wants an emotional and physical divorce, but not a financial one, not a legal one, just in all other manners, essentially. It was like his friend, the press lord William Randolph Hearst, had done. So thus the cardinal explained to Swanson that such a thing was impossible. Here, too, historian Goodwin is skeptical. There is no evidence that Boston's cardinal was even in New York at this time. Well, that doesn't prove anything. He could have gone on it to do Joseph Kennedy's bidding, and he may well have done so. I mean, I can picture a cardinal responding to a powerful man by saying, "Yes, I will help you uphold your marriage," which would be your Catholic duty, right? To not divorce. So he may well have done the bidding of Joe Kennedy. Who can say that he didn't? I don't think that there's no evidence that he went to New York. I mean, they're not that far apart. You know, you take a day trip on an off day. Like, it's not that big of a deal. In fact, after ending his affair with Swanson, Joe renewed his commitment to Rose and the family, moving them to a 20-room, $250,000 brick Georgian mansion on nearly 6 acres in Bronxville. By the fall of 1929, Joe's romance with Gloria Swanson was fast fading. They would make one more movie together, and he would have other romances. But he was losing interest in Hollywood, and he began to liquidate his holdings and made plans to get out of the stock market for good. Gloria was left with a pile of debts and no husband. We're on to Chapter 3. Joe finds a hero in Franklin D. Roosevelt. By 1930, Joe was at the peak of his health. Handsome, copper-haired, with plenty to smile about. He had seen the Depression coming, and weeks before the stock market crash of 1929, he had taken himself out of the game. He was now estimated to be worth $100 million. So he had gotten out at the right time, retained his cash while other people's fortunes plummeted. That year, Henry Morgenthau introduced him to Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He, Joe, decided to place his bets on Roosevelt the way he had been placing his bets on stocks. "I wanted him in the White House," he later said of FDR, "and I was willing to do anything to help elect him." When FDR declared that he would run for president, Kennedy threw himself into the campaign. Jack joined his brother Joe at Choate in the fall of 1931 after a difficult year at Canterbury Prep. That was a Catholic school from which he had been forced to withdraw because of health problems. This is going to be a pattern in Jack's life that we see of him trying something academically, and it's not the academics that take him out, it's his health. As a sophomore going out for the Choate yearbook, Jack met Kirk Lemoyne Billings, a big, unkempt blonde boy, and would form, according to Billings, the closest friendship either of us ever knew. Lem Billings was descended from Mayflower aristocrats, and his early life had been privileged until his wealthy father lost everything in that 1929 stock crash. Billings Sr. had died shortly before Lem met Jack, and he was attending Choate on a scholarship. I was immediately captivated by Jack, Lem recalled. He had the best sense of humor of anybody I had ever met. And in his company, I had more fun than I had ever had in my whole life. No matter where we went, he knew how to make the outing a special occasion. If we were at a show together, he had somehow managed to sneak backstage to see the leading singer. If we were eating out, he'd be so charming that we'd end up with extra dessert. He enjoyed things with such an intensity that he made you feel that whatever you were doing was absolutely the most wonderful thing you could possibly be doing. You can see it in videos, and you can see it in the way that people magnetically attached themselves to Jack Kennedy. I mean, anybody who becomes president has to have some sort of charisma. We have a person at the center of the presidency right now who, love him or hate him, he rose to the top of business, he rose to the top of entertainment, and now he's president. Whatever you do, you can't look away from him. It's been the same with many of our presidents. Barack Obama had a charisma that drew people to him. Bill Clinton, I happened to be in the Arkansas Capitol, I think less than a week after he left the presidency. He came, I believe it was within a week of him leaving the presidency. He came to the Arkansas Capitol and met with lawmakers there. And I got to see him. Extremely charismatic man. So the men that have achieved that level of leadership often do have a charisma that is exactly what he's describing, this intense enjoyment where when you're around them, you feel like there's nothing better you could be doing. I mean, again, I remember that feeling. We got to sit in the Arkansas House chamber and hear Bill Clinton speak, and he was absolutely the most charismatic person I had ever encountered in real life. You couldn't take your eyes off of him. He just had a magnetism that held your attention, and it's very similar to what he's describing here. Now we get kind of a gross story about Lem and Jack and their connectedness. At 17, Lem and Jack even lost their virginity together, traveling to Harlem in full evening dress one night so that they could share the same prostitute. The woman charged each of them $3. It was part of the Kennedy tradition of sharing women. Gross. Since his affair with Swanson, Joe had returned to Rose in every sense of the word. And on February 22nd, 1932, she gave birth to her ninth and final child. Young Jack, who asked to be the baby's godfather, wanted to name him George Washington Kennedy. But he was overruled, and the baby was christened Edward Moore Kennedy, which I didn't realize that Jack was his godfather. Did you guys know that? That was new to me. The family the future Senator Teddy was born into was very different from that in which Joe Jr. and Jack had spent their formative years. The older children were off most of the time at boarding school. Rose was traveling, and Joe was more and more involved in the world of presidential politics. So not only did this thing of like, raise the older ones right and the younger ones will do this, but also, and for those of you who don't know, I actually have a very large family as well. We also have 9 children, like the Kennedys. But one thing I've learned over those years is that you actually cannot duplicate the same childhood. There is no situation in which even 2 children, even if they're close in age, I suppose maybe you could make the argument for twins, but any singleton-born children can't have the same 2 parents, because even over the course of a year or 2 or 3 between children, the parents grow and change. One small example from my life would be when my oldest child was the only child, I could 100% govern the influences that went into his life. I could think about what shows we would or wouldn't watch together. If there was something inappropriate or something even questionable, I could watch it during his nap time or just not watch it at all. I could think about the music and lyrics that were going into his little mind. I could carefully select every book that he would encounter, and I could govern every social decision of his life. But the older kids, once they are in our lives, then they influence the younger ones. So by the time we had our 4th or 5th child, Our oldest child is now watching Chronicles of Narnia. He's moved on to more advanced stories that involve wizards or witches or death or war, things that I would have guarded him from when he was 2, 3, and 4. Well, now his 2, 3, and 4-year-old siblings are hearing talk of things that even he wouldn't have been hearing about. So even when you're very, very careful, and even if you're not allowing evil into the home, and even if you're not like Rose off traveling the world, there is no scenario in which 2 or 3 or 4 children in the same family can have the exact same childhood experience, because your home and your parents and your influences shift over time, just naturally, and even necessarily, because you grow wiser. You, in some ways, grow less controlling about certain things that you realize maybe don't matter, and more concerned about other things. So yeah, here's Teddy growing up in a completely different home, and not at all in the sense of, because I raised the older ones right, now they're influencing the youngers. No, the older ones are off. They're off doing their own thing, even getting prostitutes and such, while the younger one is at home being born and not being raised by his parents. He's being overseen by maybe a governess or a nurse or family friends, while his father's off doing politics and his mom is off traveling because she can't even stand her own life. Rose, burdened with supervising 9 children, attempted to run her family like a business, as conscientious as any employee of her husband's. And when it got to be too much for her, she would take a trip. Between 1929 and 1937, so that's over a period of 8 years, while most of the United States was mired in the Great Depression, listen to this, Rose traveled to Europe 17 times. So in just 8 years, 17 trips to Europe. That doesn't even include the California, Florida, all the other trips she's taken. This is just her European travels. When in New York City, Joe stayed at his personal suite at the Waldorf Astoria, while Rose kept a large apartment of her own at the Plaza. The children recognized that their parents led separate lives. Barbara Gibson, Rose's last secretary, recalls being in the swimming pool with Rose and Jean Kennedy Smith when Jean commented, "You were the first promoter of women's lib, Mother. You stayed in one hotel and Daddy was in another." She explained to Gibson, "My friends at school were always amazed at how my parents didn't live in the same apartment in New York." Wow. It sounds like she's admiring it. I mean, you can see this situation where it's not only the boys being groomed to accept this behavior, it's the daughters as well. By 1932, Joe was part of FDR's inner circle. At the Democratic Convention that year, he demonstrated his usefulness by convincing William Randolph Hearst to throw the California's delegation votes to Roosevelt, thereby breaking a deadlock and assuring FDR the nomination. Joe also gave Roosevelt $25,000. Soon he was traveling in a private railroad car along with other key FDR aides. After the election, however, Joe waited in vain for an appointment, the way he had waited to be chosen for one of the important clubs at Harvard. Well, that's where we're going to leave it today. I hope you enjoyed this reading. Let me know what you thought of all of these situations where Joe and Rose are being overlooked socially, overlooked for honors, overlooked even like this for electoral appointments, and yet achieving some level of a success in Hollywood, definitely financial success, social success, because they're traveling, they're making connections, they are definitely of an elite set. And yet, the thing that they were most known for, of having this successful family, does not at all feel like a success to me. What about you? I mean, not just what we know their family turns out like, but even just by any measure, would you want a father and mother of yours to treat you in this way, to not be involved in the first month of your life, to be traveling away with business and having affairs with fancy women and inculcating that into your life or your siblings' life, or like the mother, having these high levels of expectations religiously and academically and yet never being present in your life, traveling and leaving you to the nurses or the assistant or whoever to care for you. That just sounds like a horrible upbringing. Now, at the same time, they had a screening room in their vacation home. They had a vacation home. They kept upgrading. I mean, did you hear they went from a 9-room to a 12-room to a Hudson River to a brick this, and they're just advancing through the ranks financially. They have trust funds. They have financial means, and yet they don't actually have their parents with them. They don't actually have moral examples. So let me know what you think about this season of Kennedy life. In the next one, we're going to get into more about the children, and also a little bit more about Joe Sr. before we start transitioning towards the next generation. So come back for that in episode 3. I'll look forward to that. I hope you are enjoying this book. Let me know in the comments, and have a great day.